You might want to keep the mop moving, janitor, this room is way above your pay grade. The laughter came quickly, sharp and effortless, echoing across the glass walls of the 34th floor conference room overlooking downtown Chicago where late morning sunlight bounced off polished oak and stainless steel coffee carafes, and Elijah Carter didn't look up right away, his hand steady on the handle of a gray industrial mop bucket as if the words had simply passed through the air without finding him, but the room had already shifted. Executives in tailored navy suits and crisp white shirts leaning back in ergonomic chairs worth more than the janitor's entire monthly paycheck, their laughter casual, comfortable, practiced, the kind that came easily when they believed someone else didn't belong, and Elijah moved slowly across the carpeted edge near the wall, methodical, quiet, his uniform a simple dark gray polo tucked into worn black slacks, a laminated contractor badge clipped to his belt that read, "Facility Support," and nothing about him suggested power, nothing about him hinted at ownership, nothing about him suggested that in less than an hour the hierarchy in that room would collapse, but for now he listened, the presentation screen glowing with quarterly projections that were already slipping off course, numbers that drifted upward without substance, and one executive, a tall man with silver cufflinks, tapped the screen with a laser pointer and said, "If we push this strategy into Q3, we'll dominate the West Coast by September," while another nodded confidently, flipping through printed packets, and Elijah paused briefly near the whiteboard, his eyes moving over the projections, calculating, analyzing, recognizing the flaw within seconds, but he stayed silent, dipping the mop head into the bucket and rolling it along the polished floor near the entrance, because silence had always been his advantage, silence let people reveal who they were. Silence let arrogance grow loud enough to expose itself, and across the table a woman in a charcoal blazer leaned forward and whispered just loud enough to be heard, "I swear they send anyone in here now," prompting another ripple of laughter that bounced off the glass walls, and Elijah's expression didn't change, he simply adjusted the angle of the mop and stepped aside as one executive pushed back his chair slightly, barely acknowledging him, as if he were part of the furniture, part of the background, part of the environment that existed only to serve, and outside the window, traffic crawled along Lake Shore Drive like a slow-moving river of steel, and inside the room, confidence thickened, voices overlapping, ideas thrown around without challenge, and Elijah listened to every word, his gaze occasionally lifting toward the screen, absorbing every flawed assumption, every rushed conclusion, every overestimated projection, until the silver-cuffed executive gestured toward slide 7 and said, "This is the future of the company," and Elijah stopped, just for a second, his hand resting on the mop handle, his posture calm, composed. And when he spoke, his voice wasn't loud, wasn't confrontational, just steady, measured, and precise. "You might want to double-check the margin assumptions on slide 3, and the room went quiet for half a second before someone chuckled, then another, and then the silver-cuffed executive leaned back, smirking, "Did the janitor just give us financial advice?" And the laughter came again, louder this time, and Elijah Carter nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something only he understood, then resumed moving the mop slowly along the edge of the conference room floor while the presentation continued, unaware that the quiet man they had just dismissed had already memorized every mistake they were about to make. The laughter faded into the rhythm of the presentation as Elijah Carter moved toward the far end of the conference room, guiding the mop carefully along the polished floor while the executives returned to their confident projections, their voices filling the space with assumptions that sounded certain but rested on fragile foundations, and Elijah listened without interrupting, his eyes occasionally lifting toward the 48-inch display mounted on the wall where graphs climbed in smooth blue lines that promised growth without resistance, and one executive with a sharp Boston accent leaned forward and said that their expansion into California would add at least 12% revenue by the end of the fiscal year, while another nodded and added that they could cut operational costs by eliminating regional redundancies, and Elijah felt the familiar sensation settle in, the quiet calculation that had guided him through decades of negotiations, mergers, and acquisitions, the instinct that noticed what others overlooked, and he rolled the mop bucket slowly past the long walnut table where leather chairs stretched in a row, each seat occupied by someone who believed they understood the future of the company, and near the far corner a young analyst shifted in her seat, glancing briefly at Elijah before looking back at her laptop as if something about his calm presence unsettled her, and the silver cufflink executive continued confidently, saying that they had modeled every scenario, that the risk was minimal, that the board would approve the plan within days, and Elijah paused again near the digital whiteboard, studying a column of numbers that did not align with the projections, his fingers lightly adjusting the edge of a cleaning cloth as he considered the margin discrepancy, and he remembered another room years earlier in Detroit where a similar projection had collapsed within 6 months, when confidence had replaced caution, when leadership had mistaken momentum for stability, and he kept his voice measured. When he spoke again, not loud, not challenging, just steady, "Your logistics cost assumptions appear to be based on last year's fuel averages," and the room turned toward him again, surprise quickly replaced by amusement, and a man seated near the window shook his head, smiling as if indulging a harmless distraction. "We are good, janitor, focus on the floors," and another executive leaned back, folding his arms. "This is why we keep meetings private," and Elijah nodded once, accepting their dismissal without resistance, then moved toward the doorway, pushing the bucket slowly, his posture relaxed, but the young analyst glanced again at the screen, her brow tightening slightly as if she had just noticed the same inconsistency, and the silver cufflink executive clicked to the next slide, outlining a timeline that compressed months of preparation into a few weeks, and Elijah watched silently, recognizing the pressure building beneath their confidence, recognizing the optimism that often appeared before costly mistakes, and as he reached the door, he set the mop against the wall and wiped his hands with a folded cloth, his eyes moving across the room one last time, memorizing faces, voices, and decisions, and just as he stepped aside, a quiet notification sounded from one of the executive laptops, a small chime that went mostly unnoticed, except for the young analyst who glanced down at her inbox, her expression shifting slightly as she read a subject line marked urgent, her eyes moving quickly across the screen before she looked up again toward Elijah, who remained calm, silent, and observant, as if he had already anticipated the moment before it arrived. The young analyst hesitated for a moment before raising her hand slightly, her voice careful but audible enough to cut through the steady flow of confident projections, and the room shifted just enough for the silver cufflink executive to pause mid-sentence, glancing toward her with mild impatience. "Yes, Emily," he said, and she swallowed before speaking. "I just received an internal notice about a revised ownership briefing scheduled for this morning," and a few executives exchanged quick looks before one of them laughed softly, waving a dismissive hand. "Probably another legal update, nothing urgent," but Emily did not look convinced, her eyes flicking once more toward Elijah Carter standing near the doorway, his posture calm, his expression unreadable, as if he already knew the contents of the message before it had even arrived, and the presentation resumed with renewed confidence. The next slide revealing a bold expansion timeline stretching across 18 months, with milestones highlighted in bright blue, and one executive leaned forward, tapping the table lightly as he spoke. "We push aggressively, capture market share, and finalize acquisitions before competitors even react," and Elijah watched quietly, recognizing the overconfidence woven into every word, the assumption that momentum would replace strategy, and he stepped forward again, lifting the mop slightly to move past the table, his voice calm when he spoke. "Your acquisition timeline assumes immediate regulatory clearance," and the silver cufflink executive sighed audibly, turning toward him with a polite but strained smile. "We appreciate your enthusiasm, but we have legal teams for that," and another executive added with a chuckle, "Trust me, this is not your lane," and Elijah nodded slowly, as if acknowledging their certainty, then moved toward the digital whiteboard, wiping a faint smudge near the corner while the discussion intensified, and outside the window clouds drifted slowly across the skyline, softening the sunlight that filled the room, and Emily glanced again at her laptop, scrolling through the message she had received, her expression tightening as she read further, and the silver cufflink executive clicked to the next slide, outlining projected earnings that climbed sharply through the next fiscal year, and Elijah paused again, his gaze steady on the numbers, calculating silently, recognizing the fragile assumptions beneath the surface, and he spoke once more, quieter this time. "Your growth curve assumes stable supplier contracts," and this time the laughter came quicker, sharper, and one executive leaned back, shaking his head. "You really do not give up, do you?" while another added, "Maybe we should put him on the strategy team," prompting a ripple of amusement across the table, and Elijah allowed a faint nod, neither defensive nor embarrassed, simply absorbing the moment, and Emily's laptop chimed again, louder this time, drawing her attention back to the screen, and she read the new message, her eyes widening slightly before she glanced up toward Elijah once more, as if connecting something she could not yet explain, while the executives continued confidently, unaware that the quiet corrections they had dismissed were forming a pattern, and Elijah Carter remained near the doorway, hands resting lightly on the mop handle, calm and observant, as if waiting for the exact moment when confidence would give way to clarity. Emily shifted in her chair again, her eyes locked on the email now open across her screen, and the more she read the more her posture straightened, the uncertainty in her expression slowly turning into something closer to realization, while the conversation around the table continued without pause, voices layering over one another as executives debated rollout timing, staffing changes, and regional leadership assignments. And the silver cufflink executive leaned forward confidently, saying that once the board approved the plan they would begin restructuring immediately, and Elijah Carter remained near the doorway, quiet and still, his hands resting lightly on the mop handle as if he were simply waiting for the right moment to leave, but he did not leave, he watched, he listened, and Emily finally cleared her throat, her voice hesitant but determined. "I think this message might be related to today's meeting," she said. And a few heads turned again, mild impatience flickering across their faces. "What does it say?" one executive asked, and Emily glanced down at her screen before answering carefully. "It says there is a revised leadership briefing scheduled for 10:30 this morning, mandatory attendance, all senior leadership required," and the silver cufflink executive checked his watch, then leaned back slightly. "We are already in a leadership briefing," he replied with a faint smile, but Emily continued, her voice steady now. "It also says the briefing will include an introduction from the new majority stakeholder," and that sentence lingered in the air longer than expected, causing a few executives to exchange puzzled looks, while one of them shrugged dismissively, "Probably just another investor update," and another added, "Legal usually sends those out without context," and Elijah's expression did not change. He simply shifted slightly to move the mop bucket aside as one executive stood briefly to stretch, then sat back down, and Emily glanced toward Elijah again, noticing the calm in his posture, the quiet confidence that did not match the role they had assigned him, and she returned to the email. Scrolling further, her eyes narrowing as she read the final lines, and she spoke again, softer this time. "It says the new stakeholder will be attending this session in person," and the silver cufflink executive gave a light chuckle. "Then they will have to find another room," he said, gesturing casually around the table. "We are already underway," and the room relaxed again, confidence settling back into place, while Elijah slowly moved along the wall, wiping a faint mark from the glass panel near the door, his movements unhurried, controlled, as if the timing of everything unfolding was already known to him. And Emily watched him for a moment longer, her instincts pulling at her attention, and one executive clicked to another slide showing projected headcount reductions, discussing efficiency and restructuring with detached certainty, and Elijah paused briefly, his gaze moving across the slide, absorbing the decisions being made without full understanding, and he stepped back toward the doorway, the mop bucket rolling quietly across the carpeted edge, and just as he reached the door, Emily's laptop chimed again, this time louder, and she glanced down quickly, her eyes widening as she read the subject line that appeared across her screen, and she looked up toward Elijah Carter once more, the pieces beginning to connect, while the executives continued speaking, unaware that the quiet presence they had dismissed had already shifted the direction of the room without saying another word. The second notification appeared at the top of Emily's screen with a subtle chime that sounded louder than it should have in the quiet confidence of the room, and her eyes moved quickly across the subject line that read Executive Access Authorization Confirmed, her fingers hovering above the keyboard as she opened the message fully, and as she read the details her posture straightened, the tension in her shoulders becoming visible, while the executives continued discussing staffing cuts and restructuring timelines, their voices steady and assured, and the silver cufflink executive leaned forward again, pointing at a chart that projected operational savings within 90 days. Saying that decisive leadership required bold moves, and Emily swallowed before speaking, her voice quieter but more urgent. "There is an access authorization update attached to the briefing," she said, and one executive glanced at her with mild impatience. "Emily, we are in the middle of something," he replied, but she continued, "It says the new stakeholder has already checked into the building." And that drew a few more looks around the table, curiosity flickering briefly before fading into Dismissive smiles, then security will guide them upstairs, someone said casually, and another added, they usually wait for introductions anyway, and Elijah Carter remained near the doorway, wiping a faint mark from the glass panel as if none of it concerned him, his movements calm and unhurried, and Emily scrolled further, her eyes narrowing as she reached the final line, and she hesitated before reading aloud. It says the stakeholder may already be present in the meeting location, and... That sentence hung in the air longer than expected, causing a subtle shift in posture around the table, a few executives glancing toward the door, then back at one another, and the silver cufflink executive gave a small laugh. Well, they are not exactly hiding, he said, gesturing toward the empty seats at the far end of the table, and another executive leaned back comfortably. We will know when they walk in. And Elijah moved the mop bucket slightly to the side, his gaze briefly lifting toward the presentation screen before returning to the floor, and Emily watched him again, something about his stillness drawing her attention, and she remembered the calm way he had corrected their assumptions, the quiet precision in his voice, and she glanced back at the email attachment, opening the authorization file, and her eyes widened slightly as she read the name listed under Majority Stakeholder Access Credentials, and she looked up again toward Elijah Carter, her expression shifting from curiosity to realization, while the silver cufflink executive clicked to another slide outlining leadership restructuring, and one executive joked about trimming unnecessary positions, prompting a few quiet laughs, and Elijah remained still near the doorway, hands resting lightly on the mop handle, calm and observant, and Emily's heart began to race as she read the name again, confirming what she had just seen, and she glanced from the screen to Elijah once more, the pieces aligning slowly, while the executives continued their confident discussion, unaware that the quiet presence standing beside the door had already changed everything before a single word of introduction had been spoken. Emily's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of her laptop as she read the name again, the letters clear and unmistakable, Elijah Carter, Majority Stakeholder, Full Executive Authority, and her gaze lifted slowly toward the man standing quietly near the door, his posture relaxed, his expression calm, as if he had already anticipated the moment when recognition would begin to spread. While the executives continued their discussion, voices steady and confident, and the silver cufflink executive clicked to another slide showing projected leadership changes, speaking about accountability and performance metrics, unaware that the quiet presence in the room already held more authority than anyone seated at the table, and Emily hesitated before speaking again, her voice measured but uncertain. The authorization file includes full executive access credentials, she said, and one executive waved a dismissive hand. That is standard for majority stakeholders, he replied, but Emily continued. It also says immediate operational oversight begins today, and a few executives exchanged brief glances, curiosity flickering again, though the silver cufflink executive leaned back comfortably. Then we will present our strategy directly, he said with a confident smile, and Elijah Carter shifted slightly, moving the mop bucket aside as he stepped toward the glass wall, wiping a faint mark with steady precision. His movements unhurried, controlled, and Emily watched him closely now, the calm confidence in his demeanor contrasting sharply with the role they had assigned him, and she glanced back at the email once more, her eyes scanning the final line that confirmed the stakeholder would initiate the session personally, and she looked up again, her voice quieter this time. It says the stakeholder will begin the briefing, and the silver cufflink executive chuckled lightly. Then we will welcome them when they arrive, he said, and another executive joked about the timing, prompting a few relaxed smiles around the table, while Elijah Carter placed the cloth neatly beside the mop bucket and stepped forward slightly, his gaze lifting toward the presentation screen as the next slide appeared, outlining revenue forecasts built on fragile assumptions, and he studied the numbers calmly, absorbing every detail, and Emily felt the realization settle deeper, her eyes moving from the screen to Elijah again, connecting the quiet corrections he had offered earlier, the precise observations dismissed as interruptions, and she hesitated before speaking once more. The access credentials show active badge authorization on this floor, she said, and one executive glanced toward the door briefly, then shrugged. They will be here any minute, and Elijah Carter reached into his pocket, pulling out a simple folded cloth, wiping his hands slowly as he stepped closer to the table, still calm, still composed, and the room remained unaware of the shift unfolding in plain sight, while Emily watched him approach, her expression reflecting the growing certainty that the new leadership had already arrived. Even as the executives continued speaking, confident in plans that were about to be challenged by the quiet man they had dismissed only moments earlier. Elijah Carter stepped forward slowly, leaving the mop bucket near the wall as the executives continued speaking, their attention still fixed on the glowing presentation screen, and the silver cufflink executive gestured confidently toward the final slide, saying that the strategy positioned them for long-term dominance, his voice steady and certain, while Emily watched Elijah move closer to the table, her heartbeat quickening as the realization settled fully in her mind, and Elijah stopped beside the end of the table, his posture calm, his expression composed, and without raising his voice he reached toward the wireless presentation remote resting beside a stack of printed reports, his movement quiet but deliberate, and the silver cufflink executive paused mid-sentence, glancing at him with mild irritation. "We are still presenting," he said, and Elijah met his gaze calmly before speaking, his tone even and measured. "I know," and with a single press of the remote the slide changed, replacing the projected growth curve with a new title that read Executive Ownership Transition Overview, and the room fell silent. Instantly, confusion flickering across faces as executives leaned forward to read the screen, and Elijah stepped slightly closer to the display, his presence steady, his voice calm. "These projections rely on assumptions that do not hold under current market conditions," he said, and the silver cufflink executive frowned, rising slightly from his chair. "Excuse me," he began, but Elijah continued, his tone respectful yet firm. "Fuel costs increased 8% over the last quarter, supplier contracts expire within 60 days, and regulatory approval timelines have shifted by at least 90 days, and Emily watched as recognition spread across a few faces, the same concerns he had raised earlier now presented with clarity and authority, and Elijah pressed the remote again, revealing a revised projection, one grounded in realistic timelines and adjusted margins, and the silence deepened, executives glancing between the screen and the quiet man at the front of the room, and Elijah spoke again. "Aggressive expansion without operational stability increases risk beyond acceptable thresholds," and the silver cufflink executive took a step forward, his confidence wavering. "Who authorized this update?" he asked, and Elijah turned slightly, meeting his gaze with calm certainty. "I did," he replied, and the room stilled completely, Emily watching as the weight of those words settled across the table, and Elijah rested the remote lightly in his hand, his posture relaxed yet unmistakably authoritative. "My name is Elijah Carter," he continued, his voice steady and composed. "I am the majority stakeholder effective this morning," and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything spoken before, executives exchanging stunned looks, their earlier confidence dissolving into uncertainty, and Elijah pressed the remote once more, revealing the final slide displaying acquisition details and leadership authority, and he added quietly, "And I will be leading this briefing from here forward." The silence held for several seconds after Elijah Carter finished speaking, the kind of silence that reshaped a room, and the executives who had filled the space with confidence only moments earlier now shifted in their chairs, glancing at one another as if searching for confirmation that they had heard correctly, while Emily watched quietly, her earlier realization now confirmed, and the silver cufflink executive cleared his throat, attempting to recover his composure. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said carefully, but Elijah did not move, his posture steady, his gaze calm, and he pressed the remote again, revealing official documentation across the screen, acquisition details, voting percentages, and executive authority effective immediately, and the room leaned forward collectively, eyes scanning the information that left little room for doubt, and Elijah spoke again, his voice measured. "The acquisition finalized at 8:30 this morning, and operational oversight transferred immediately afterward," and one executive shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward his laptop as if hoping to find a different explanation, while another quietly checked his phone, likely searching for confirmation, and Emily noticed the subtle change in posture around the table, shoulders tightening, confidence fading, and Elijah continued calmly, "I listened to your projections, and I appreciate the ambition, but leadership decisions must be grounded in sustainable strategy," and he advanced to the next slide, displaying revised timelines, operational safeguards, and phased expansion models, and the silver cufflink executive remained standing, his earlier authority replaced by uncertainty. "You were in the room the entire time," he said slowly, and Elijah nodded slightly. "Yes," he replied, and the weight of that simple answer settled heavily across the table. And another executive spoke quietly, "You were correcting us earlier," and Elijah gave a small nod. "I offered observations," he said, and the realization deepened, expressions shifting from confusion to reflection, and Emily watched as the atmosphere changed completely, the hierarchy that once seemed fixed now rearranging itself in real time, and Elijah stepped closer to the screen, his voice calm but firm. "Leadership is not about titles, it is about clarity, and clarity begins with listening." And he paused briefly, allowing the words to settle, while one executive slowly lowered his eyes, recalling the earlier laughter, and another adjusted his notes, suddenly attentive, and Elijah advanced to the next slide, outlining immediate priorities, stabilizing supplier agreements, reviewing regulatory timelines, and reassessing expansion assumptions, and he concluded quietly, "We will move forward with discipline, not assumption," and the room remained still, the earlier confidence replaced by focused attention, and Emily noticed the subtle shift as executives straightened in their seats, no longer dismissive, no longer amused, but attentive, as the quiet man they had underestimated now guided the direction of the company with calm authority. The room remained quiet as Elijah Carter advanced to the final slide, the skyline outside now softened by drifting clouds while the late morning light reflected across the polished table, and the executives sat differently now, their earlier ease replaced with focus, their attention fixed on the man who had quietly shifted the direction of the meeting without raising his voice, and Elijah rested the remote on the table. His posture relaxed yet grounded in authority, and he spoke calmly, "Before we move forward, there is something I want to address," and several executives exchanged brief glances, the weight of his words already settling in, and Elijah continued, "Leadership is not measured by who speaks the loudest, or who sits at the head of the table," he said, his voice steady, "it is measured by who listens, who observes, and who recognizes risk before it becomes reality." And the silver cufflink executive lowered his eyes slightly, recalling the earlier laughter, while Emily watched quietly, sensing the moment unfolding, and Elijah looked around the room, meeting each gaze without tension, without anger, only calm clarity. "I entered this room this morning without a title," he said, "and I listened to every assumption, every projection, and every decision," and the silence deepened as executives reflected on the earlier dismissals. And Elijah continued, "Confidence is valuable, but unchecked confidence creates blind spots, and blind spots cost companies millions," and he paused briefly, allowing the message to settle, then added, "We will move forward differently," and he advanced to the final slide, displaying a revised leadership framework built on collaboration, measured expansion, and accountability, and one executive nodded slowly, adjusting his notes, while another leaned forward, attentive now in a way he had not been before. And Elijah concluded, "I did not interrupt earlier because I wanted to understand how decisions were being made, and now that I do, we begin again," and the room remained still, absorbing the shift in tone, and outside the window the city continued moving, unaware that inside the conference room the direction of the company had quietly changed, and Elijah picked up the remote once more, his voice calm but decisive. "We start with supplier stability, regulatory alignment, and realistic timelines," he said, and executives began taking notes, their posture aligned with the new direction, and Emily glanced briefly toward the mop bucket near the wall, the symbol of the role they had assigned him, and then back toward Elijah, recognizing the quiet lesson that had unfolded in real time, and Elijah finished with a final statement, his voice steady and composed, "Titles introduce authority, but clarity earns respect, and today we move forward with clarity." And the room remained silent for a moment longer before executives nodded in agreement, the earlier laughter replaced with understanding, and the quiet man they had dismissed only minutes before now stood at the center of the room, guiding the company forward with calm authority.